Welcome everyone to Being a Consciously Inclusive Leader, and before we get into our content, I'm going to do something insanely stupid, and that's to talk about statistics right off the bat. So just a couple quick studies here for us to think about. First of all, there was a study done where they took a resume, they copied it, and they only changed one thing, and that was the name on the top of the resume. So on one version of the resume, they had a quote-unquote white-sounding name. On another version of the resume, they had a quote-unquote black-sounding name. Now, they sent these identical resumes out to actual open recs for jobs, and they found that the black-sounding name, quote-unquote black-sounding name, was about 10% less likely to receive a callback than the quote-unquote white-sounding name. Now, sadly, they repeated this study over and over again and got the exact same results. Another study looked at the salaries of women based upon their hair color. Now, they looked at women with comparable skills and experience in similar jobs, and they found that the blonde-haired folks made about 7% more salary than their brown-haired or dark-haired or red-headed counterparts. Now, it's not to say to go out and dye your hair blonde and all of a sudden, boo-hoo, 7% increase in your salary. But again, they repeated this study over and over again with very similar results. Third study looked at the height of American CEOs. Now, in the US, those men who are 6 feet and over, it's a little less than 15%. But 60% of US CEOs, male CEOs, are over 6 feet tall. Kind of leads you to think of this one Netflix show. A character said, Washington, Lincoln, Jefferson, tall men make great presidents. But when you take a look at these three studies, what do you think they have in common? And you can use the chat if you'd like to kind of share your ideas. What do they have in common? Yeah, exactly right. Bias, specifically unconscious bias. And that's a conversation that we're going to have here today. I guarantee that a board of directors hiring a new CEO didn't look at somebody and say, you know what? That guy is over 6 feet tall. I bet you he'll make a fantastic leader and really contribute to our bottom line. No, that's not what's happening. But we see businesses and workplaces make decisions based upon those unconscious biases, and we want to get ahead of those because we want to be more consciously inclusive leaders to make better decisions and to create that sense of belonging for all the folks within our workplace. Hello, everyone. My name is Dr. Steve Vaccavelli, pronounced he, him, and his. I'm the owner and principal of Top Dog Learning Group, a boutique consulting firm, but I'm also known as the Gay Leadership Dude. And using that title alone right there, you know a couple things about me. First of all, that I'm gay. Second of all, that I self-identify as a dude. And third, I really like to talk a lot about leadership, specifically inclusive leadership, and how we can be better leaders and make the workplace even more effective, more efficient, and a lot more fun and inclusive as well. Now, I did want to call myself, instead of the Gay Leadership Dude, the Gay Brene Brown, but Dr. Brown's folks weren't super keen on that. So thus, the Gay Leadership Dude was born. Circle arc, so I'm the only one who can use that title. So that's me. I want to ask you real quickly, who here considers themselves a leader? A show of hands, virtual, or raise your physical hand so I can see you in the window. Who here considers himself a leader? Well, as we say here in the south of the US, all y'all are leaders. And that's kind of your first takeaway. Leadership is not about role. It's not about title. It's not where you sit on the org chart. It's not having direct reports. It is about influence. It is about trust. It is about relationships. And so your first key takeaway on being a consciously inclusive leader is that all y'all are leaders, and you're going to hear me say that time and again. I've had people say, well, Steve, I'm not a leader. I just do my own thing here. Shenanigans. You have influence. You are a leader, and we'll talk a lot about leadership in our conversation here today. I do want to tell you to hold on. We are going to cover a lot of territory in the limited time we have talking through this topic. So we're going to spend our time at the 10,000 foot level, but I will tell you ways you can dive deeper into this topic. You're not going to walk out of here in 60 minutes or less being an absolute expert on being a consciously inclusive leader. No. However, you will walk out of here with strategies, tools, tips, ideas to be even more effective than you already are and create that sense of belonging for all the folks within your workplace and beyond. There is a handout, a participant guide. I do encourage you to scan the QR code and access that. You can take notes on it virtually or in person if you print it out. But it also has a lot of things we'll talk about that you can use after you leave the session to kind of make yourself a bit more inclusive. You'll also hear me say the word workplace, and you've probably heard that a couple times already. The conversation we're having here today isn't just about work, although, yes, I will frame it in that way, but the strategies, tools, tips that we'll talk about can really be applied outside of the workplace as well. And I do encourage you to do that and practice those as you move out to make the world a bit more inclusive. Now, I said it before about the concepts of leadership, and I really started understanding what leadership was from my mom. And yes, this is me, my bad Harry Potter glasses, circa 1989. So yes, you might be doing the math, trying to figure out how old is he. But my mom was an elementary school secretary, and I talk about her in my last book, Pride Leadership, Strategies for the LGBTQ plus leader to be the king or queen of their jungle. And my mom was the secretary at the school. She's actually the only one, but she ran that school. And she told me never underestimate the power of the admin, because as we think about building relationships, building rapport, making inclusive spaces, you don't want to do it just for the people who are next to you or above you. It's everyone around you. And because my mom ruled that school, she was the one the principal would go out to after they would interview a potential teacher and say, Joyce, how did they treat you? Did they make you feel included and special as they should? Yes, they did, or no, they treated me like I was about to do their laundry. And so keep that in mind as you think about creating inclusive spaces. It's for everyone, because all y'all are leaders. We want to be sure that we're broadening that space. Now, I did mention briefly my last book, Pride Leadership, and the conversation we're having here today is actually from Chapter 3 of Pride Leadership. And as we think about being consciously inclusive and creating consciously inclusive leaders, again, that is all y'all, but we're going to have those conversations or concepts about that. But I want to tell you how Pride Leadership came about. And how we got to this conversation here today. Now, I've been doing this stuff, inclusive leadership, for my whole career. And it's about 30 some years. And over that time, and I've worked with some really fun folks, some great leaders, heart-centered leaders, successful leaders, you start to see patterns of behavior. You start to see ones that are really doing some awesome stuff, and you see some that really just aren't doing so well. And that's kind of what led me to organize things in what success means to leaders are leveraging these 6 leadership competencies. And I'll kind of quickly review them so you understand what I mean here. The first is having authenticity. Leadership courage, leveraging empathy, effective communication, building relationships, and shaping workplace culture. And so these are the 6 that over my 30-ish years of doing this stuff, I've seen the most successful leaders embrace these, and the leaders who aren't so successful not embrace these. And so I said, that's going to be the leadership book I write, really focusing your energy on these 6 competencies for success. And as I started getting things together, I started looking around at my LGBTQ brothers and sisters and siblings. This is the symbol of Orlando, but they rainbowed it. So it's the gay symbol of Orlando. But I started looking around. I do a lot of advocacy work in LGBTQ equality, and I started looking at my peers doing the same. And then I started to kind of notice some things. And if you're familiar with the show Sex and the City, not the new one, but the older one from the 90s, and you may not, so let me explain this. There is the main character, Carrie Bradshaw, and she was a columnist. And so somewhere at the beginning of each episode, she'd open up her little MacBook and she'd say, I couldn't help but wonder. And that was kind of the hypothesis or the thesis statement that she would do to write her column. And it was the subject of the rest of the episode. So I'm looking around, I'm looking at these LGBTQ plus leaders, and I couldn't help but wonder, is there something about the gay experience, meaning the broad term, that makes folks look at this rainbow, look at these competencies a little bit differently? And so that's kind of how Pride Leadership was born, through me taking my generic leadership ideas and putting it through the rainbow lens. I think everybody should be playing around with these 6 competencies, regardless of who you are. But in my book, I kind of talk about that. And so what does that look like? So for example, let's play with authenticity. A lot of amazing folks are talking about authenticity, like the amazing Dr. Brene Brown. Again, I am not the gay version of her, just to be clear. But if you think about authentic leadership, it's powerful. It makes impact. And that's what we mean by being you actually makes you even more effective and successful. You're not hiding, you're not playing a role. If you are, for example, a more introverted person, don't play an extrovert. People can see it and it doesn't feel good for you. And so leadership experts has been saying, yes, authentic leaders are much more successful. They're impactful. They build trust. Yes, 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 and. And so that's kind of when we talk about being your authentic self is really bringing that to the table. And so these 6 competencies, yes, by all means, are every leader can be applying to them. But that's in Pride Leadership, I kind of focus on those because at the end of the day, when I'm playing around with these 6 competencies as any leader, we are actually being consciously inclusive. And it sets us up to be consciously inclusive leaders. And again, that's all, y'all. All of us here in this space are leaders. And before we get into strategies to actually execute that, I want to do some level setting on a couple definitions that we're going to play around with in our conversation here today. The first one is one I absolutely know you've all heard of, and that's the concept of diversity. And using the chat area, how would you define diversity? Yes, yes, yes. All of that. All of the things you put in the chat. So actually, if I take those and distill it at its core, diversity is the many similarities and differences between people. Period. So that's race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, physical ability, handedness, neurodiversity, my education, my parental status, all of these different pieces and parts are what contribute to the similarities and differences between people. Now, you often hear the concepts of diversity and inclusion. So I'll actually define this one for you. If we think about the concepts of inclusion, it's a place. It's a place with a culture of respect, collaboration, and connectedness for everyone. So diversity is the many similarities and differences. Inclusion is that culture that we're creating. Now, what you might be hearing now in the modern workplace is the concept of belonging. And belonging really flips the script. And where diversity and inclusion are more about the workplace, we're inviting folks in, here's what we strive to do. Belonging is about the individual, the team member, the employee. And it's really saying that as a team member or employee, it's a feeling I have where I feel that I'm safe and that I'm welcomed to be my authentic selves within the workplace. And so really at its core, being a space of belonging is really good allyship. And actually at its core today, our conversation is being a good ally. You're creating that space, that sense of belonging for all folks, any of us, others, and well beyond. And that's kind of where we want to have the conversation on how to do that. Now, one of the things that I have learned over the years, when I first started playing around with these concepts, my mentor is actually at the Walt Disney Company where I first became kind of invested in the concepts of diversity and inclusive leadership. And my boss, and she acknowledges, or my mentor, she acknowledges that she didn't make this up, but I still credit her because it's the first time I heard it. She said, diversity, you're invited to the dance. Come on in. We have this activity. We'd like you to be here. Where inclusion is being asked to dance. You're being actively involved in the conversation. And so I would add to it that the belonging is I'm dancing however the heck I want. It's totally cool. No one's judging me. And if you have ever seen Seinfeld and Elaine dancing on Seinfeld, and if you're like, what is that? Google it. Don't Google it now because you're listening to me. But Google, we all want to dance like Elaine or not, and no one's going to judge us, and it's totally fine. And so that's kind of what we want to play around with, creating that sense of belonging, that no one feels unsafe, everyone feels welcome, people can be their authentic selves. That's what we're striving to do when we be a consciously inclusive leader. And again, all y'all are leaders, so that means everybody who's listening to me in this space here today. So how do we do that? Well, again, at its core, being consciously inclusive is creating that sense of belonging. And that's really where we want to focus our energy here today. But beyond that, I want to tell you how I started using that phrase. And again, it started at Disney when I was playing around. I'm sitting there with my little Mickey ears on and talking about inclusive leadership. And I was actually doing a class on unconscious bias. And, doing the concepts, having a conversation, and there's a person in the back of the room, and we'll say it's Pat. This isn't Pat, but we'll pretend that's Pat. And Pat just looked like they ate a lemon. Real sour look on their face, was not enjoying the conversation. And so at some point during a break, I walked back to Pat and said, Pat, is there something on your mind? And Pat said, Steve, talk about unconscious bias? Well, if it's unconscious, I can't do anything about it. And Pat gave me a gift that day because it really got me thinking, okay, when you say unconscious bias, unconscious things you don't know anything about. And so that's when I started using the phrase consciously inclusive because it's active. We can do something about it. And that's what we're going to talk about today. What can we do to be consciously inclusive leaders? But before we do that, I want to kind of take the antonym, the opposite, and play around with that for a few moments. And that's the concept of being unconsciously exclusive and really move into what does that mean, when we're unconsciously not thinking and we're excluding folks but not even realizing it because of that unconscious bias. Fact, we as humans are receiving 11 million bits of data at any one moment. What? What does that mean? Well, you think every nerve ending on your body is receiving data right now. All the cones in your eyes, the cilia in your ears, all of these nerve endings are receiving lots and lots and lots of data. Neuroscientist friends say it's 11 million bits at any one moment. Interestingly, though, we can only consciously process 40 bits of data at any one moment. 40 bits. Getting 11 million, you can focus on 40. So that delta, that gap, that 99.9999996%, I've count my nines, is managed on your unconscious. And you've seen this happen to you before. You put your hand down on a hot surface and it's like 1 alligator, 2 alligator, 3, ow! That was your unconscious and your conscious kind of having a quick chat. Like, hey, psst, hey, Steve, hey, you might want to put, I'm getting data right now and it's really hot. So you might want to put that on your 40 bits focus right now. Oh, okay, yeah. And we do this all the time. Why are we wired that way? Well, it's because of this guy. Well, maybe not him, but he's representing our cave ancestors. And back in the cave days, a big woolly saber-toothed thing would come to our cave ancestors' cave door, and they would sit there, well, it's got big teeth, but maybe it's an herbivore. No, we had to make some quick decisions based upon little bits of data in order to survive as a species. So little bits of data, and it's that fight or flight mentality. Big teeth means bad things. I need to either fight, fisticuffs up, get him out of my cave, or flight. Go out the back cave door and all things are fine. We were wired to this way from a safety mechanism to make some decisions so that the survival of the species kind of perpetuated in dangerous situations. Those red berries are not good things. I'm not going to eat those. And so you have that little bit of data. Well, flash forward to today. Basically with the future represented by these folks. And we're not typically in those big saber-toothed woolly situations, but we're still wired to make those decisions that way. And I guarantee you are doing it sometimes on a daily basis. For example, ever been on a low-cost carrier like this one? Where you don't have a seat picked out, you don't figure that out until you get on this plane. And then you're sitting in your seat, there's an empty seat next to you, and you're judging people immediately who are coming down the aisle. No, I don't want you. No, I don't want you. Yeah, you can sit here. That's fine. So what's the basis on those decisions? We are making those kinds of assumptions based upon little bits of data all the time. And to be a consciously inclusive leader, we want to get our head around that. We really want to think about that. And so what we want to first do is figure out, well, how were these formed? How did I decide that person could sit next to me versus the other person who just walked by, and base it upon that little bit of data? And I like to think about it as when we are born, all of our perceptions, all of our ideas of what something should be are just this big, beautiful square of granite. And now what happens to granite as you drop water on it? You can use the chat if you'd like to answer that. Yeah, 100%. It gets shaped. You shape the shape of the granite over time. You see these beautiful rock formations out in different areas of the world, and they are shaped and maneuvered by water, maybe by wind, but something hits that perspective of granite, if you will. And I'm going to give you a quick example, and I'll use me as an example. So yes, there's me, circa 1980 something, middle school Stevie. And middle school Stevie is just going through his little middle school life, and he turns on the TV, and on that TV, there is a scientist. Now, using the chat, what do you think that scientist in mid-80s looked like for little Stevie to see? Yes, it was a dude, oh man, it was a middle-aged white dude, absolutely. So in that square of granite that is in little Stevie's head on what a scientist should look like, there is a drip of water. Drip. Middle-aged white dude is what a scientist should look like to little tiny Stevie. Okay, little Stevie goes to the movies and he watches the latest James Bond flick. And if you're a Bond fan, you know that the scientist, the main scientist for James Bond to interact with was Q, quartermaster, if you didn't know. But Q was the scientist that gave James Bond all of his cool stuff. What did the James Bond of the 1980s ish look like for little Stevie to see from that audience? Yep, number one, very fast fingers, Joan. Yeah, so middle-aged white dude, drip drip, maybe with a nicer accent, maybe a white coat, who knows at this point, but still middle-aged white dude. Little Stevie goes to his sixth or seventh grade science class, and who's standing up in front of the room? But Mr. Jarvie. I remember Mr. Jarvie. He was a middle-aged white dude, drip drip drip. So typically speaking, our unconscious biases on what something should be or is not this deluge of one experience, but it's a combination of all these drips from media that we're exposed to, family, friends, the greater society as at large. So we start to realize that we are sometimes are influenced by those different data points around us. So really, when we start to think about unconscious bias, it's really not do we have bias and unconscious bias, but rather which ones do we have? And that's one of our strategies we'll talk about in a few moments on us to be a more consciously inclusive leader. We got to start here and we'll figure that out. I want to read a quick quote here that you might find of value, and I'll actually make myself go away. Unconscious bias in organizations is like a current in the ocean. When you swim with it, you don't necessarily notice it, but when you have to swim against it is when it becomes all too clear that you're swimming against that current. And some knucklehead who's speaking to you right now said that. But it's very true. When you have to swim against that current, boy, you know it. It feels horrible. But when you're in that in group, as we call that, no big deal. What? This is fine. This is easy. Yeah. And so what we want to do as consciously inclusive leaders is try to mitigate that current as best as we can, or get the opportunity to help everybody swim along that current. Because why does this matter? It matters to every single leader in this room. Again, that's all y'all. But it really matters to us as a workplace as well beyond. Because ultimately being consciously inclusive leaders leads to a workplace where people feel that sense of belonging and that feeling of trust. And what does that do? That leads to workplace success. Time and again, we've seen that when people feel they belong, they do better. They contribute more. They generate more revenue. They bring themselves fully to work and give it their all. And that could be success to the bottom line, to innovation, to retention. Define that what you will for your specific workplace. But this is not just a way to make the world better, although I truly believe that is. It leads your workplace to be more successful. Yes. And that's what we want to spend the rest of our conversation here today talking about. How do you, as a consciously inclusive leader, be more consciously inclusive? And to do that, we're going to play around with a three-pronged strategy to think in, speak up, and act out. And that's at its core, the three ways that we can be more consciously inclusive leaders. So let's start our energy or focus our energy on the think in part. And to do that, we're going to do a quick activity. And now you don't have to do this, but I encourage you. It's kind of fun. It's only going to take about 5 or so minutes, but it's a really interesting way to start to explore kind of what the think in thing is all about. So what this does is you're going to see on the screen here in just a few moments, I'm going to go away and you're just going to see a black screen. And in the upper left-hand column is going to be the word male. In the upper right-hand column is going to be the word female. Now, you're going to see, and it's going to flash very quickly, a yellow word in the middle. If that word in the middle is more associated with male, you're going to raise your left hand and say left. Or if you're using the keyboard, you'll hit the D and the K key. So D will be the same as your left hand. If you see a word in yellow briefly on the blank screen and in your association, it has to do more with female, you're going to raise your right arm and say right, or just hit that K key. And you don't have to hit enter after each one. You're just hitting the keys and then you're just going to get a line of Ks and Ds or whatever that looks like as we go forward. So that's kind of how this is going to play out. Again, female on the right, male on the left. Here we go. Do you feel like this now? After having gone through that activity You might have seen in those 4 rounds of doing the left and the right thing with just 10 words each, but you might have had some different reactions from round 1 to round 4. And what you were doing with some of you, maybe not everyone, was when you got to round number 4 and the words you'd already seen, you were sorting them through 2 categories, but you might have had slower reaction times, either on the keyboard or raising your hand this way. That's because your conscious and unconscious may have been having a quick chat. And preventing you from immediately kind of identifying. And that's really what we've done is mimic what's called Project Implicit. Now, this is a great tool. You can scan the QR code there or look at the link in the participant workbook or handout. And it's a really cool tool to help you start to think and explore what potential unconscious biases you have. Now, this was a project created in 1989 by a consortium of 3 researchers, Drs. Greenwald, Benashie, and Nosik, who said, is there a way for us to start to measure potential unconscious biases? And I'm using those words on purpose, potential unconscious biases. And it's because, they've done it about 15,000 of these a week. They're free, so you can go and play with them. And 6, that's actually much higher by now, 6 million tests since it started. And the cool thing is it helps you start to get an understanding on your own unconsciousness. And it's a data point. So you don't go out and say, oh, I took this Project Implicit thing Steve told me to, and now I'm a blankist. No, that's not what it means. It's no different than gathering data when you take your blood pressure. One point in time does not a heart rate make or heart healthiness indicate. And that's what Project Implicit does. But it can potentially help you start to uncover what unconscious biases you have. So for example, when we just did the example just a few moments ago, we were looking at, is there a potential unconscious bias that you have in relationship to gender and the STEM professions? For some of you, like, nope, Steve, I was round 4 to round 1, pretty much the same thing. Others might, I was a little bit hesitant. Yeah, that could be an indicator that there may be, I'm doing very much my legal words on purpose, that could mean that there is a potential unconscious bias there, and we want to explore that maybe a little further. Because that's what Think In is all about. What do you do as a consciously inclusive leader to get your own house in order and really think through what can I do for myself to really change and bring about different thoughts and actions if that's what I want to do? So the first one we really already talked about, explore those with Project Implicit. Again, it's free, give an email, and there's a whole bunch of different reports that you can pick on a whole bunch of different biases. Do you have a bias against able-bodiedism, people who do not have any sort of differing ability than you? You could be on race, could be on religion, could be on all sorts of things. I encourage you to explore those. It's free, and just see, is there potential unconscious biases that you may have? The second idea is extending your comfort zone, getting beyond what you're used to and makes you comfortable. That could be joining a different group than one that you've already been a part of. Maybe it's working with another group that you haven't had the opportunity. Maybe it's looking at different agendas or ideas and media sources that maybe you don't typically consume. I know when this is a great way where you're in an employee resource group. And if you're not familiar with what those are, you might be in a place that has basically groups for demographically similar people within your workplace. Could be the women's group, could be the vets group, could be the people of color, could be the LGBTQ plus group. A lot of organizations have these. And what I encourage you to do is play around with joining one that you're not demographically a part of. When I worked at IBM, I joined the Women's Network because I wanted to better understand the challenges that my female colleagues were going to. Now, I wasn't there to be the male savior. I'm here to save the day. No, that wasn't my job. My job was to listen and to understand and to broaden my comfort zone. And I remember one time I was supposed to be pulled into a meeting with my boss, and he's like, oh, let's do it at Thursday at blah, blah, blah. Like, no, I can't. I have a women's leadership meeting. He's like, what? And it was such a great experience for me because I really started to understand the challenges that not only my IBMer female colleagues were facing, but some women in general. And it was a beautiful way to get out of my own comfort zone, expand my perspective, find something that you can do that's very similar. The last idea to think in is really start to look at the concept of mindfulness. And if you're not familiar with that concept, mindfulness is the act of deliberately noticing new things, being present, and considering new perspectives in a non-judgmental manner, or the essence of engagement. Dr. Ellen Langer professor of psychology at Harvard, and considered the mother of mindfulness. Mindfulness is not some granola crunchy yogi thing, although yay yogis, I am practicing one, but it's really a way to just be more aware of what we're doing, what we're saying, what we're feeling in a moment without that judgment. And it's a really great way for you to start seeing what you're doing, hearing what you're saying, especially when you're having different stimuli, like someone just walked down the aisle in that airplane and you're like, oh, no, yes, why? And that's what we want to do, though, think in. We want to get to those whys. In my book, Pride Leadership, and my latest book called Your Career, we talk about getting a drone perspective. I just think drones are cool. But like if you get into that drone and you have the little camera and you're just looking at the situation from above, yes, that's what smart leaders want to do, is really get into that mindfulness stage and see what they're saying and doing and try to get to the root. Is it how I'd really want to say it in a perfect world? Or maybe there's some opportunity to kind of change that and maybe do those different words or different actions, etc. So 3 ideas for help you to think in about your own self. So just kind of close it up. It'd been nice for Pat to have maybe a little bit more awareness and really gotten into that extending their comfort zone, because it might have made Pat just a little bit more happy in the world and maybe influence those around Pat to be more inclusive. Let's move into the speak up portion of our 3-pronged strategy to be a more consciously inclusive leader. And to do that, I want to tell you a story. I'm in a conference room, and it's one that looks similar like this. So let's get me in that conference room. There, now I'm in the conference room. I'm in a conference room in Atlanta, and where I'm at a client site. It's myself and Lori, one of my top doggers, one of my consultants, and her and I are sitting somewhere over here on the side of the conference table. There's 38 other folks in the room. It's a pretty crowded room. People are really excited. This was actually the final meeting for a project we were doing. We're doing an inclusive leadership thingy. And everyone's just in a good mood. It was basically just like the recap and then celebrate with cake or whatever afterwards. And right about there is where the senior executive is sitting. And that senior executive is the one who literally wrote the checks to my little business and was overall in charge of this project. And he's sitting there having a chat with somebody, and his gender is important to the story. So we're just about to start, and you hear that senior executive turn to the person who was there and say, well, you know how all women drive. And silence. The entire room, including Laura and I, just kind of looked over at him and looked his way, but no one said a word. It was just that screech of the record and silence. Now, at that moment, every single one of us was not defending the rights of all the women in the room, and we were engaging what's called silent collusion. Silent collusion is the practice of neither defending or supporting nor defending the rights of others to be fully included in the workplace. And it's really something that, as we think about being a consciously inclusive leader, where you just remain silent when someone says a disparaging or, quite frankly, stupid remark that we really didn't want to hear and did not need to hear, but when we don't say a word, we're silently colluding or supporting that statement being said. If you disregarded everything I've said during our conversation here today, don't do that. If you want to be a consciously inclusive leader, be a heart-centered leader, a successful leader, one that builds rapport and trust with those around you, don't engage in silent collusion. Why? Because I already said the word, trust. When you engage in silent collusion, the trust that you build up with those around you can erode. And I've seen it happen many times over, unfortunately, where someone says a disparaging remark, you know how women drive, and no one says a word. People are watching you as a leader. And remember, all y'all are leaders, so people are looking at what you do, what you say, and what you don't say within the workplace. And we want to be sure that as leaders, we want to foster that trust. We want to not engage in that silence, because being on stage, we're always being looked at, and we want folks to say, you know what? Steve didn't say anything when he said, you know, women drive. What if it's my group? Or what if I am part of that group that was just disparaged? That's not cool. And so don't do that. And you might be saying, well, Steve, that was the senior executive. What if she said some disparaging remark about some other group? I can't say anything to her. I'm a low person on the org chart. I'm not even on the same page as her. Well, again, this is where when we talk about those 6 competencies to be conscious, inclusive leaders, we might need to pull up the courage one and exercise that leadership courage in that moment. But Steve, you might say, how about I just talk to her after the meeting in a private room? Is that good enough? Yeah, it's going a little bit further than just not saying a word. But what you've done is you've given up the opportunity to show other people that, you know what? No, I'm creating space for others, and I'm not going to defend that silly statement being said, so that others are heard. And I want to give you a tool that can help you in that moment when someone says a disparaging remark, a women drive or whatever, to in that moment have that courage to kind of stand up for the rights of others. And to do that, I'm going to pull in Sam. Sam is, do you know what kind of dog Sam is? You can use the chat if you'd like to identify. What kind of dog is Sam? Not a poodle. No, kind of looks like a poodle. Yeah, pulley mop. Very good. Yeah, Sam is a Hungarian pulley mop, or they call it a mop dog for short. And so if I take Sam's breed and I take Sam's name, we get Mop Sam. And this is the 6 strategies that you can remember in the moment to beat silent collusion when it's happening. And now, side note, I know this is cheesy. You're like, a dog, Steve, like a little dread dog, and Mop Sam. What the heck? I know. However, when you're in that moment, and in all sincerity, you might get emotional in that moment. Maybe you're part of the group that's being disparaged. I want to give you 6 strategies, and you'll remember Sam now. Trust me. But in that moment, you're like, oh wait, Sam told us these 6 strategies. What are they? And then pull that out and use that in that moment. And me, out, point, say, ask, move. And you're like, well, what is this? We're going to go over it in a few moments. It's actually also in the handout in the participant guide. And it goes into deeper, just for the sake of time. We're not going to talk about the pros and cons of each one, but each one does have a pro or con. And there's also a link to a free online learning tapas, as we call them in my business, little learning nuggets that both you can use as well as share with others to kind of help them play around with this Mop Sam, because it's much better in numbers than it is just being that solo person having the courage to refute those statements being said. So the first M in Mop Sam is me. You ask yourself, is this statement something that impacts me personally? So going back to our example with You All Women Drive, it might be, well, as a woman, Bob, I find that statement to be inaccurate. I consider myself a very good driver. So this one's good because you're part of the group and you're saying, no, I'm not part of that stereotype, I'm part of the group. So I'm already exhibit A in refuting that. So that's one strategy that you could do. You have the M and you ask, is it about yourself? Is it about me? And if so, then you kind of make a statement similar to this one. The O in Mop Sam is you call out any absolutes, stereotypes, or gross generalizations that you're hearing from the person making the statement. And so it might sound like, so Bob, you've driven with every woman in the world? And you listen. Now, some of these, like the O, it may depend on your personality and your comfort level. If you're a smarty pants, like I am, I love using this sarcasm as a sword and shield, especially in situations like this. So kind of use it. If doesn't fit you, don't use it. You have 5 others that you can play around with. But that's the O in Mop Sam. The P is you point to a specific example that refutes the statement that's being said. So this one, you might have to have extra data, which you could or could not. But it might be, well, actually, Bob, I think we would both agree that Juanita, who drove us to lunch yesterday, is an awesome driver who happens to be female. So again, I'm not the exhibit A, but I might say, hey, but I know you have seen exhibit A. So that doesn't stand up with your statement that you just said. The S in Mop Sam is you say a non-word that at the very least indicates you don't agree with what's being said. What does that sound like? Whoa. What? Damn. Huh? So a non-word that you can ask. So again, this is great because immediately you're going to know, oh, Steve's not on board with that. If I go, whoa. But I'm not calling Bob out on the statement. So that's kind of the blessing and the not so good part of that one. The A in Mop Sam is you ask. You ask the person exactly what they meant by their comment. And it says just that. Bob, exactly what did you mean by that statement? Now it's not, Bob, what did you mean by that statement? Same words, but my tone, intonation, rate of speech are something different. And so be careful with this one and a couple others like it. You want to really do all of these in an even, neutral tone so Bob doesn't get his shields up. Or whoever you're talking to doesn't get their shields up and get on that defensive. So Bob, what did you mean by that statement? Typically speaking, in a lot of these, Bob is acting out of his unconscious bias. All women are bad drivers. And so when you ask something like this in that non-judgmental manner, it's pulling that to the 40 bits, the 40 areas that Bob can focus on. And then Bob's, oh, I didn't mean that, backpedal. But you've done your job. You let people know I'm not on board, and you call Bob out on their statement. And last but not least, may not work in every situation, but the last M is move. You physically remove yourself from the situation. So little less available within the workplace, especially the physical workplace, but great at parties. When someone starts telling a not so cool joke, and you're like, mm-mm, and you just walk away, head to the buffet and kind of go from there. Me out, point, say, ask, move. So 6 ways we can beat silent collusion in its tracks and really create that speak up on behalf of inclusion for us all. Act out, the last stop. And before we get into act out, I want to kind of take a step back and say, if we think about the thinking, it's about you. The speak up is kind of who's immediately around you, kind of your team members, coworkers, peers, whomever, where the act out is now broader, bigger, more impactful, you may say, because it's about the bigger organization. And we want to kind of play around with 4 ideas. And you'll see my legal asterisk at the top. We'll talk about that in just a few moments. But 4 strategies that you can start with in order to act out to create a more inclusive workplace. The first one is educational ideas. What formal and informal trainings, lunch and learns, stuff can you do to educate people on unconscious bias, being more inclusive? I mean, we haven't even scratched the surface on inclusive language. We talk about MOPSAM, but what about some of those words and phrases that when you kind of start to research really aren't super inclusive? And so exploring that's a whole other conversation we can have. But what is happening within your workplace to educate people on how can we create that sense of belonging for all the folks within our workplace? The next one is workplace artifacts. And so what are you seeing when you get to your web page and you have a leader identified? What does a leader look like? On your page that talks about your benefits for your family, what does that family look like? I was doing a training class at a company. It was a bunch of engineers, it's a global engineering company, actually. And I set up the room. It was an inclusive leadership program. I was expecting like 25 leaders to show up. And I got everything done. I just started walking around the lobby. And I walked around the lobby, and there was these 4 big, beautiful black and white images of actual workers doing their engineering stuff. And using the chat, I'll engage you. What do you think I saw in common for those 4 images of actual employees doing their engineering thing at this particular company? Yes. I would say perceived men. And I would actually add they were perceived to be fairly similar in age, but overall, the 4 images, not a whole lot of diversity happening. And so, I put that note aside, walked into the room, all the students came in, and I said, we're going to go on a field trip. So we all stood up, walked around the lobby, came back in, and I said, what did you see in that lobby? And they're like, those images all look the same. Like, yes, and we're going to talk about strategies for you not to do that in the future. And I think that's what we mean by workplace artifacts. What are you seeing? What words are being used that are maybe not as inclusive as they could be? And so what can we do to kind of change that? When we have different things on our website, maybe it's something as small as, am I including my pronouns in different things like in my Zoom or by email signature? That signature is an artifact within your workplace. What are we doing that's being inclusive or maybe exclusive to people feeling they have that sense of belonging? The third one is structures and systems. What in your business are you doing that's inclusive or maybe exclusive? So could be the policies, could be how we do hiring or recruiting, all different things that we want to start to analyze and say, is somebody being disenfranchised by this structure, by this system? I was working with another client, a large pharmaceutical company, and I was doing other work, and the EVP of HR I was working with, she turned to me and said, oh, I wanted to share with you, we just updated our bereavement policy, and it now includes grieving for non-human family members. And I almost wanted to cry because I thought, now in this life, I am not a human parent, but I'm a canine parent, and I love my dogs. I actually only have one now, because when I lost my canine daughter a couple years ago, I was devastated. And when she just said that, I'm not even part of her business, but I felt seen. I felt valued just by that little statement? Do you think this massive pharmaceutical company is going to lose gazillions of dollars by someone saying, you know what, I just lost a pet, I'm going to need to take the day off? No, they're not. But do you think that's going to go a long way for people feeling seen and heard? Oh, absolutely. And so what can you do within your workplace to look at the structures and systems and policies to make some differences? And last but not least, accountability. When we think about accountability, it starts with you, but also how are you holding others accountable to be more consciously inclusive? Are you looking at the different policies that you've said in number 3, and are you making sure that people use them and do them? Add those pronouns to that email signature, whatever it looks like. How are you providing feedback when someone hiccups or says something like, women drive? Are you using MopSam to hold each other accountable for inclusive language and words? That's where we want to start to have that conversation on how do we all get involved, because we're going to mess up. We are humans. We are going to say someone's pronouns wrong when they tell us what their pronouns that they use are. Fine. Get that data, learn from it, and move on. And I think that that's what accountability is all about. How can we create that culture where people can mess up, we can learn from it, and we can move on and still create that inclusive workplace? Now, I did say, there is a little asterisk at the top. It says, you probably can't read, it says, these are just a start. These are just 4 that you can take and start to work on as soon as we're done here today, and see what else can you do to create a more inclusive workplace for everybody within your business. Think in, speak up, and act out. So really, if you think about it, it's you, them, and us collectively within the greater organization. Now you have some strategies you can immediately start to play with in all 3 of those different areas. And there's even some additional information listed in the participant guide, kind of toward the back of that can help you dive that deeper and create a workplace that's more inclusive. Because at the end of the day, we really want to broaden that perspective. We really want to think about what can we do to create that sense of belonging in the workplace so that everybody feels that they belong. And your challenge right now is to start to incorporate these strategies into your own behavior, share those with others, and as well as the rest of your workplace, and apply them to make the world a bit more inclusive for us all. Because at the end of the day, it's up to you as a leader, because all y'all are leaders. Thank you so much. I'll stick around here for if anyone has any questions or comments, but otherwise, thank you for making the world a bit more inclusive for everyone. And I encourage you to apply these strategies and be even more awesome than you already are. Thank you.